The Russian dictator Putin was in such a hurry to boast to Trump about his supposed victories that he personally announced to the whole world the alleged complete capture of Kostiantynivka in the Donetsk region. However, this complete Kremlin fake lasted only a few hours before it was debunked by the soldiers of the 19th Army Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, who recorded videos from different districts of Kostiantynivka showing that the city is under the control of Ukraine's defense forces.
The statement about the alleged capture of Kostiantynivka is yet another piece of disinformation intended to create the illusion of success against the backdrop of massive personnel losses and the failure to achieve their stated objectives. The reality is different. In the video, Ukrainian Armed Forces servicemen are in different districts of the city and confirm Kostiantynivka is under the control of Ukraine's defense forces.
Once again, Putin has mistaken wishful thinking for reality, but as it turns out, Kostiantynivka is far from the only and far from the largest deception that is leading Russia's top leadership to the brink. The Kremlin is drowning in lies, while the Ukrainian armed forces quietly reclaim dozens of square kilometers of their land. These territories had been under Russian control for an entire year. A French analyst and the Deep State Project confirm this. Moreover, maps are being falsified for Putin. OSINT researchers have caught the Russian general staff in a massive fabrication for the dictator. How Russian generals drew an extra 2,000 square kilometers of victories. Supposedly, they have already captured Chasiv Yar and are storming Zaporizhzhia. Greetings, this is the channel Ukraine Today. All the details of the real front and Kremlin absurdity right now. My name is Andrei Silakov. Let's begin. French military analyst Clément Molin has released sensational information that in one of the key sectors of the front, Ukrainian forces have carried out a brilliant offensive operation over the past month and a half. Under conditions of complete operational silence, the Ukrainian armed forces regained control over about 50 square kilometers of territory that had been held by the Russian army for more than a year, and in the process also liberated several more villages.
In one of the sectors of the front, the Ukrainians took control of significant territories over the past month and a half, liberating several villages in the process. We are waiting for an update from Deep State so as not to compromise operational silence. But roughly 50 square kilometers, which had been under Russian control for more than a year, are now controlled by Ukraine.
Moreover, these territorial breakthroughs are backed by simply phenomenal enemy loss figures. As Minister Fedorov reported, in June alone, Ukraine's defense forces struck more than 200,000 targets and incapacitated nearly 28,000 occupiers, either killed or severely wounded. The main focus of the strikes has shifted to enemy logistics. The number of strikes on depots and supply routes at distances of more than 50 kilometers from the front has almost doubled. June in general brought several absolute records at once, and all of them were captured on video.
A record number of enemy artillery pieces were destroyed, and 49,575 enemy drones and copters were intercepted. This is the best result ever. An absolute record was set for destroying enemy vehicles and motorcycles. Each of these hits is confirmed by video footage.
This quiet but extremely effective operation by the defense forces literally stunned the Russian command. Offensive actions began with a powerful mechanized assault. With the help of UAVs, our fighters created an absolutely impassable zone for the enemy, minimizing their own losses. The occupiers were so helpless that throughout June, they managed to upload only 2 videos online, which ultimately confirmed Ukraine's advance. After that, in a panic, they dropped 75 glide bombs across a wide sector that just yesterday they considered their rear.
The ongoing counteroffensive, which is taking place in complete silence, demonstrates the Ukrainians' ability to create an impassable zone using UAVs, advancing while minimizing losses. Otherwise, we would be seeing Russian videos. Notably, the offensive began with a mechanized assault, which proves that armored vehicles are not obsolete.
Against the backdrop of these real successes by the Ukrainian armed forces, the Kremlin leadership continues to stubbornly broadcast an alternative reality to the masses. Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov went on a propaganda radio station and indulged in wild fantasies about the outstanding and very important successes of the Russian army. However, the secret behind Peskov's successes was immediately uncovered by independent OSINT researchers.
OSINT analyst Monstas compared the official frontline map from the Russian Ministry of Defense with data from reputable analytical projects and uncovered falsification. by overlaying the Deep State and Suryak project maps onto the map that was displayed in the office during Putin's meeting with the generals, the analysts discovered a huge discrepancy.
The results were staggering, but the fact itself was not surprising. So as not to upset the bunker dweller, Russian generals resorted to a grand falsification of paper maps for meetings. The discrepancy between the fabrications of the Russian general staff and the reality on the ground amounted to a colossal 1,950 square kilometers in favor of the occupiers' imaginary victories. Ukrainian observers are also drawing attention to this general nonsense, noting that on Putin's maps, Russian troops have supposedly already completely taken Chasiv Yar, have come right up to Sloviansk, Kramatorsk and Dobropilya, and are actively storming the approaches to Zaporizhzhia.
In other words, this is exactly the nonsense that Putin recently read from a teleprompter in front of the camera. And yes, looking at this nonsense, you might believe that Russia will soon capture Donbass, or even Zaporizhzhia. That's what Putin believes, Shrike commented ironically on the total disinformation within the Russian leadership.
In reality, Putin's military commanders are simply drawing thousands of square kilometers of foreign land in folders marked secret. And the dictator obediently reads this nonsense from the teleprompter in front of the cameras. While the Kremlin indulges itself with imaginary greatness, Ukrainian soldiers and technology continue to methodically destroy the real forces of the occupiers on the actual battlefield. Moreover, at sea, the Russians have suffered a very real and humiliating fiasco. As officially stated by the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Navy, Dmytro Pletenchuk, the defense forces have finally deprived Russia of dominance over a significant part of the Black Sea. Now the Russian fleet is no longer able to block sea routes or threaten civilian vessels. The myth of the Kremlin's invincible naval blockade has sunk along with their fake victories on the maps.
If just a few short years ago they actively and aggressively attempted to implement a full naval blockade of Ukraine, today the Russian fleet simply no longer possesses those same strategic capabilities across the western, southern, or even the central parts of the Black Sea region. If just a few short years ago, Russian ships would regularly venture out into the open sea, deliberately block off specific maritime areas, threaten civilian vessels, and even try to detain them. At this point in time, this is simply no longer the case in any way whatsoever.
And while the Kremlin desperately draws virtual victories, reality keeps delivering crushing surprises to Moscow. The Ukrainian Armed Forces are not just holding the front, but are also reclaiming their territories, methodically blinding Russian air defenses. Ukrainian missiles have become a nightmare for military factories deep in the Russian rear, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for Putin's generals to hide this failure. Details in our report. It seems that Moscow has trapped itself in the snare of its own ambitions. The war that was supposed to break Ukraine has instead turned it into one of the most capable armies on the continent. The Ukrainian army has not only held out but continues to liberate territories. According to the commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, since the beginning of the year, the defense forces have regained control over more than 670 square kilometers of Ukrainian land, and in May, Ukrainian troops were even able to reclaim more territory than they lost. And the greatest paradox is that it was Russia itself that accelerated this strengthening. For years, the Kremlin spoke about the demilitarization of Ukraine, but the result turned out to be exactly the opposite. Ukraine has received modern weaponry, invaluable combat experience, new technologies, and now has one of the most effective armies in Europe. What was supposed to destroy Ukraine's defense has, in fact, become the largest program to strengthen it. Moreover, the war that Moscow intended to keep far from its own borders is gradually spilling over onto Russian territory itself. According to Syrsky, Ukraine's long-range campaign has already seriously affected the enemy's capabilities. Strikes on military logistics and defense industry facilities have prevented the occupiers from even reaching their planned production volumes of Shaheds. Therefore, the factories that were supposed to supply new attacks on Ukraine are increasingly becoming part of the front themselves. And it seems that the Kremlin prefers not to report this unnecessarily. The commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces stated that the Russian leadership continues to hide from Putin the loss of certain territories, the isolation of Crimea, and the consequences of strikes on military enterprises. As a result, the country that calls itself a superpower is increasingly forced to hide from its own leadership what is happening right under its nose. Despite shifting the economy to a war footing and the constant ramping up of arms production, Moscow has still not achieved the desired result. That is why there is more and more talk about a new wave of mobilization and searching for ways out of a situation that has dragged on for too long. And while the Kremlin continues to draw up maps of future offensives, the reality looks quite different. Ukrainian forces are not only holding back the enemy, but are also gradually reclaiming their land, while simultaneously creating problems for the Russian army far beyond the front line. It turns out to be symbolic. Moscow wanted to weaken Ukraine, but in the end it got a stronger Ukrainian army and a war that is increasingly making itself felt on Russian territory. Meanwhile, yet another supposedly impenetrable Russian defense has fallen to the Ukrainian Armed Forces. While Kremlin propaganda talks about the world's densest air defense system, Ukrainian forces are increasingly disproving this lie. We're no longer talking about isolated, successful strikes, but about systematic efforts to destroy key elements of Russia's air defense. According to the drone forces, the operator of the Roni group regularly disables radars in the Bryansk region, which monitor the skies in the direction of Moscow. Simply put, the Russian system is losing its eyes exactly where they are needed most. And when the radars stop seeing the airspace, even the most expensive air defense systems start to work less effectively. And it seems that the consequences are already being felt far beyond the Bryansk region. It is precisely through such breaches in the defense that Ukrainian long-range drones are increasingly reaching targets that until recently were considered almost unattainable. St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, Moscow. The list of targets is gradually expanding, and with it, the number of uncomfortable questions for Russian generals is also growing.
Russian air defense breached. This is not a fabrication from social media, nor is it a coincidence. When the enemy loses its eyes, the sky opens up for our long-range strikes.
Operation Polyphemus showed that it is not enough to simply place radars and air defense systems on the map. If the key elements of this system are systematically taken out of action, corridors appear in the defensive shield through which strikes begin to get through. And it seems that closing this gap over Moscow will be much harder for the Russian command than explaining its existence on television broadcasts. It's also hard to forget another of the Kremlin's nighttime nightmares, and its name is Flamingo. Ukrainian missiles are appearing in the sky more and more often, and just a few seconds later, explosions at sites that until recently were considered reliably protected. The footage of the strike on the military enterprise Titan, Barricades, which appeared online, turned out to be especially telling. In the video, you can clearly see not only the flight of the Ukrainian FP-5 missile itself, but also the reaction of the Russian, who almost immediately recognizes the silhouette of what is approaching. And in this reaction, perhaps, there is more truth about the current situation than in dozens of official statements from the Russian Ministry of Defense.
That's Flamingo.
It's not just about an impressive image, but about very real consequences. According to available information, the explosions literally scorched the production facilities from the inside.
Another one.
For a military enterprise, this means much more than just damaged walls or a roof. Technological lines, equipment, communications, and the ability to quickly return to normal operations are destroyed. The plant continues to exist on the map, but it can no longer operate as it did before. And it seems that this is only the beginning, because each new flight of a Ukrainian missile over Russian territory serves as a reminder of the main outcome of this entire story. Putin wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, but in the end he got a country of engineers, military personnel and developers of the latest weapon systems. And now it is precisely these developments that are increasingly arriving in places where people were once certain that the war would never touch them. Moreover, Ukraine's defense potential is reaching an entirely new cosmic level. The defense forces are massively ramping up the production of their own cutting-edge drones, missiles, and air defense systems, receiving tremendous support from Western allies. Ukrainian military technologies are right now becoming a powerful shield and a foundation of security for all of Europe. You can find all the details about the large-scale rearmament of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in our report. The Ukrainian defense industry is soaring to new heights. Dark times are coming for Russian Shahheads. While the Kremlin is busy calculating how many more hundreds of drones they can launch at Ukrainian cities, Ukraine has already unveiled a next-generation response. The Zirka interceptor drone looks like another step toward the moment when massive attacks will no longer be an effective weapon for Moscow. A speed of over 340 kilometers per hour, automatic target detection, and the ability to literally hunt down aerial threats. And this is just the beginning. Engineers are already working on the Zirka 2.0, which will be able to independently enter the target search area, will be equipped with the latest machine vision systems, and will have even more autonomous guidance. If these plans are implemented on the necessary scale, Russia risks facing a reality in which its cheapest tool of terror will suddenly stop working. And this means that the entire strategy of exhausting Ukraine's air defense will begin to fall apart at the seams. At the same time, Ukraine is showcasing increasingly ambitious developments that until recently seemed like science fiction. The maritime drone Mobidic, with a range of up to 1,400 kilometers and capable of carrying other long-range drones and missile drones, looks like a claim to an entirely new class of weaponry. And while Russian propaganda keeps talking about having no analogs, the Ukrainian defense sector is increasingly showcasing developments for which Moscow currently has no ready answer. Moreover, Kyiv has announced new agreements with partners to strengthen air defense. Particularly noteworthy is that this involves not only cooperation with individual countries, but also coordination between the US and European allies.
There are things we can do additionally within the framework of cooperation at the level between the United States and European countries.
This is not about one-time assistance, but about creating a new system of interaction among allies. Partners are looking for ways to make Ukraine's air defense even more effective and Russian air attacks even less successful. Ukraine is not just strengthening its air defense. An entire ecosystem of new means of protection and strike capabilities is being formed. If earlier Russia tried to intimidate Ukraine with the number of drones and missiles, now it is unclear whether the Kremlin itself has enough resources to keep up with the technological race it is beginning to lose. And it seems that this is only the beginning of a major rearmament. Ukraine is officially launching one of the largest air force modernization projects in its entire history of independence. An agreement has been signed for the delivery of 16 Swedish JAS-39 Gripen E fighter jets, aircraft that many military experts call some of the most dangerous hunters in the modern sky. And while the Kremlin continues to threaten the world as usual, Europe is effectively helping Ukraine build a next-generation air shield. This is not just about a routine replenishment of the aircraft fleet. The Gripen E is equipped with a powerful next-generation radar, advanced electronic warfare systems, and Meteor missiles capable of hitting targets at distances of over 100 kilometers. In simple terms, Russian aircraft, cruise missiles, and attack drones are going to have a very hard time. And the further things go, the harder it becomes to ignore the obvious. Ukraine is no longer just defending itself. Ukraine is shaping a new architecture for the protection of its skies, where its own innovations, Western technologies, and strategic agreements are beginning to work as a single mechanism. If just yesterday the Kremlin dreamed of air supremacy, today it is increasingly forced to think about how to operate in skies that are rapidly becoming ever more dangerous for Russian aviation. Meanwhile, while Russian propaganda convinces its population that the West is about to tire of Ukraine, the United Kingdom announces a new support package worth nearly £290 million. And this has long since stopped looking like temporary aid. Since the start of the full-scale war, London has allocated more than £21 billion to Ukraine. The amount is so impressive that Russian television prefers not to mention it unnecessarily. During the negotiations in Kyiv, the parties discussed not only the front and preparations for the upcoming NATO summit, but also the consequences of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. And it seems that these consequences are becoming increasingly painful. Fuel shortages, logistical problems, and shifting sentiments within Russian society can no longer be concealed, even behind the usual propaganda backdrops.
It is important that our partners are noting Ukraine's successes at the front, as well as the results of our middle and deep strikes. We discussed the situation on the battlefield in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, particularly in Crimea, as well as in Russia, the fuel shortage, and the changing mood of the population.
In fact, we are witnessing a new stage of cooperation between Ukraine and its allies. The West is increasingly less likely to speak only about containing Russia. Instead, there is a growing focus on specific Ukrainian achievements, and concrete decisions are being made to further strengthen Ukraine. And for the Kremlin, this is perhaps one of the most unpleasant pieces of news. After all, the bet on isolating Ukraine is so far working exactly the opposite way. Meanwhile, Moscow is facing a terrible retaliation for its strikes on Kyiv. Russian air defense, in a panic, reported a mysterious target directly over the Moscow region. Experts have started talking about the arrival of ballistic missiles, and the bold statements by Denis Stilmark directly suggest that an entirely new stage of relentless Ukrainian responses has begun. What exactly has frightened the Kremlin so much? Watch to find out. It seems that in Moscow, they suddenly remembered that war is not just about daily reports of downed drones. The Russian Ministry of Defense unexpectedly announced the interception of a Ukrainian long-range operational tactical missile over the Moscow region. And here's where things get really interesting, because just a few days ago, Denis Stilmark, co-owner of the Ukrainian company Firepoint, publicly announced the readiness of the new FP9 ballistic missile, which is capable of reaching not only Moscow but also St. Petersburg. Coincidence? Right now, the Kremlin would very much like everyone to think exactly that. Just yesterday, people in Moscow were laughing at talk of Ukrainian ballistic missiles, and today, they're already telling stories about heroically intercepting them. The situation is reminiscent of an old Kremlin playbook. First, claim that such weapons don't exist, then say they don't work, and after that, urgently report their successful destruction. If this really was the first combat launch of the FP9, then the main effect has already been achieved. People in Russia have once again started nervously looking up at the sky. And while Moscow was telling fairy tales about intercepted missiles, Ukrainian drones once again paid a visit to a strategically important facility in the Nizhny Novgorod region. The Kstovo oil refinery, owned by Lukoil, one of the largest oil refineries in Russia and a key player in supplying the country with fuel, came under attack. Judging by the footage from the scene, the encounter was a heated one. Thick black smoke rose over the facility, and the fire could be seen from dozens of kilometers away. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed a successful strike on the facility and the subsequent fire on the refinery grounds. And this no longer looks like just another story about debris accidentally falling onto an industrial site. They hit the AVT-6 unit, the heart of primary oil processing. It is precisely through such units that crude oil is turned into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other products without which neither the civilian economy nor the military machine can function. That's why the consequences could be much more painful than just another impressive column of smoke on the horizon. The Kstovo refinery is capable of processing up to 17 million tons of oil per year and is among the 4 largest oil refineries in Russia. In other words, we're not talking about a secondary facility, but about one of the cornerstones of Russia's fuel system. And while officials report that the situation is fully under control, the list of strategic sites that suddenly catch fire after a visit from Ukrainian drones continues to steadily grow. That's why Russia had to find a new way to protect itself from Ukrainian drones, by simply hiding the facilities on the map. After a series of attacks on military and industrial targets, Russian Yandex suddenly began to massively blur and remove buildings belonging to the Ministry of Defense and Defense Industry Enterprises from its services. Apparently, in Moscow, they decided if a facility can't be seen on the map, then it doesn't exist in reality either. The most important addresses of Russia's military leadership have fallen under this digital censorship. The Ministry of Defense buildings on Frunzenskaya Embankment and Znamenka Street are now blurred in satellite images. It looks as if Russian generals seriously believe that missiles and drones navigate only by Yandex maps. However, the General Staff building nearby, for some reason, remains visible. Apparently, they still haven't decided whether to be afraid or not. But the most interesting part began with the defense enterprises. Some factories and research centers have literally disappeared from city maps. Where there were buildings just yesterday, today the service shows empty fields and wastelands. It seems Russian officials have decided to invent a new kind of camouflage. Not concrete shelters, not air defense systems, but the digital magic of disappearance. It seems that after the refinery fires, explosions at military sites, and regular strikes, Moscow realized that real security isn't so simple. So they decided to focus on virtual security instead. What's next? Perhaps the next step will be to remove the entire Moscow region from the maps. And what if then Ukrainian missiles stop finding it too? However, this whole story with blurred maps and nervous statements about intercepted missiles has a very specific reason. According to Bloomberg, Ukraine's long-range capabilities have already reached such a level that missile alerts this year have been declared in at least half of Russia's territory. And these are no longer just the border regions, which the Kremlin has been accustomed to writing off as temporary difficulties. Now, alarm sirens are sounding in places where, not long ago, the war was considered something distant: the Volga region, Astrakhan Oblast, the North Caucasus, central regions of Russia, and the Moscow region. This geography continues to expand rapidly. Previously, Russian propaganda convinced the population that all threats remained somewhere near the border, but now the air raid alert map is starting to look increasingly uncomfortable for the Kremlin. Moreover, Ukraine is increasingly relying on its own developments: strike drones, cruise missiles, and new long-range systems. The arsenal is gradually growing, and along with it, the territory that can no longer feel safe. What the Kremlin recently called impossible is increasingly becoming a regular occurrence in the reports. And here the main question arises: if today air raid alerts already cover half of Russia's territory, if key enterprises are regularly coming under attack, and military facilities are even being hidden on electronic maps, isn't that why in Moscow lately there's so much talk about successfully intercepted targets? Because when the danger reaches hundreds of kilometers deep into the country, the main shortage is no longer missiles or drones, but the sense of security that the Russian authorities have conditioned their population to for so long. And what do you think about these events? Write your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and stay up to date with the most important news. There's more to come.